Anthony de Mello begins awareness with a striking claim. Most people are sleepwalking through life. They believe they are awake, conscious, and in control. But in truth, they are moved by conditioning, driven by unconscious fears, and shaped by emotional dependencies they rarely question. They respond automatically, react habitually, and suffer unnecessarily because they do not see. De Mello's message is simple, but radical. Your life changes the moment you become aware, not when you change your circumstances, but when you see them clearly. He explains that society teaches us how to think, how to behave, what to desire, and what to fear. We inherit beliefs, expectations, and emotional habits without realizing they are not our own. We learn to chase approval, avoid discomfort, fear rejection, and cling to identities that limit us. This conditioning becomes the lens through which we experience life. And until we step out of it, we remain trapped in illusion. Awakening, for De Mello, is not about self-improvement. It's not about trying harder, fixing yourself, or becoming a better person. It is about removing the blindfold, seeing your thoughts, emotions, attachments, and fears without judgment. Awareness alone transforms. When you finally see why you suffer, the suffering dissolves. When you see the root of fear, fear loses its power. When you see the ego's manipulations, the ego begins to fall away. He challenges readers to question everything they have been taught about happiness. Most people believe joy comes from getting what they want: success, validation, security, love, comfort. But De Mello argues that this form of happiness is fragile, dependent, and doomed to fail. Real happiness, he insists, is unconditional. It arises from clarity, not from control, from freedom, not from possession. The invitation of this book is not to escape the world, but to see the world as it is, not to suppress emotion, but to witness emotion, not to become perfect, but to become conscious. When you learn to observe without clinging, without judging, without resisting, you move from sleep to awakening, from illusion to truth. Awareness is a guide to inner freedom. It asks you to stop running, stop seeking, stop fixing, and start seeing. Because the moment you become aware, the chains fall off on their own. Section 1. The Illusion of Control. Anthony de Mello explains that one of the greatest sources of human suffering is the illusion that we can control life, people, and outcomes. The ego believes that if it tries hard enough, plans carefully enough, or behaves perfectly enough, it can force the world to give it what it wants. But this illusion inevitably collapses because life does not obey our expectations. He points out that we don't suffer because things go wrong. We suffer because we demanded they should go right. We suffer because we insist that life follow our script, that people behave according to our wishes, and that emotions appear only when convenient. The pain does not come from reality. It comes from the pressure we place on reality. De Mello explains that expectations are hidden demands. When reality contradicts them, the ego resists, complains, and falls into disappointment or anger. This happens not because the world is unfair, but because we believed we had control in the first place. When you assume control over what you cannot control, the past, other people, circumstances, suffering becomes inevitable. He also highlights how control creates fear. The more tightly you cling to outcomes, the more terrified you become of losing them. You begin to micromanage life, constantly worrying, monitoring, and defending what you think you need. This fragile state makes you reactive and restless. You become dependent on external stability for inner peace, a formula guaranteed to fail. De Mello's path to freedom begins with seeing the truth. You never had control. You only had preferences. You can influence, but you cannot dictate. You can act, but you cannot guarantee. The moment you accept this, something remarkable happens. Tension dissolves. You stop fighting life and start cooperating with it. You stop trying to bend the world to your will and begin meeting it with awareness. Acceptance doesn't make you passive. It makes you grounded. It frees you from the exhausting task of trying to control the uncontrollable. De Mello reminds us that real peace comes not from controlling life, but from understanding life. When you let go of the illusion of control, you stop suffering over things you were never responsible for. You regain your energy, clarity, and freedom. And life begins to feel lighter, more spacious, and more real. Section 2. The Ego and its Tricks. De Mello teaches that the ego is the master illusionist of human life. It creates a false sense of identity built from memories, labels, roles, fears, and desires, and then convinces you that this constructed self is who you truly are. The ego survives through deception, constantly manipulating your perception to keep you asleep. The ego's primary trick is substitution. Instead of letting you experience life directly, it gives you interpretations. It never says, "This is what's happening." It says, "This is what it means for me." Every event becomes personal. Every comment becomes a threat or validation. Every possibility becomes a story about success or failure. The ego transforms reality into drama and then calls it truth. De Mello explains that the ego thrives on three things: approval, control, and security. It chases praise, fears rejection, and clings to anything that reinforces its identity. This constant grasping creates anxiety and dependence. You lose yourself in a desperate attempt to feel important, loved, or safe. Another trick of the ego is emotional manipulation. It convinces you that your feelings define reality. I feel rejected, therefore I am unworthy. I feel afraid, therefore something is wrong. I feel angry, therefore someone must be blamed. The ego hides behind emotion, using it to justify its stories, but feelings are simply signals, not facts. When you believe the ego's interpretation of emotion, you become reactive and blind to the deeper truth. De Mello also reveals that the ego loves conflict, not always external conflict, internal conflict. It thrives when you judge yourself, when you compare yourself, when you chase ideals and punish yourself for failing to reach them. The ego maintains control by keeping you dissatisfied. If you were content, it would lose power. The ego's greatest trick is convincing you that awakening means fighting it. But De Mello clarifies that the ego cannot be defeated through effort. Resistance only strengthens it. The moment you try to destroy the ego appears disguised as the spiritual warrior trying to win. The only path is seeing, not resisting, not judging, not analyzing, just noticing the ego in action, watching its reactions, observing its fears, seeing its stories. And in that simple awareness, the ego loses its grip. When you see the ego clearly, you stop identifying with it. You stop believing its narratives. You stop chasing its promises. What remains is presence, the quiet, spacious awareness that exists beneath all mental noise. De Mello's message is liberating. The ego survives through unconsciousness. It dissolves through awareness. Section 3. Conditioning. the prison of automatic living. De Mello explains that most of what we call ourselves is actually conditioning, patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior absorbed unconsciously from childhood. Before we could think for ourselves, we inherited beliefs about success, happiness, love, fear, and worthiness from parents, culture, religion, and society. These inherited programs shape almost every reaction we have as adults. He argues that conditioning turns human beings into automatic machines. Someone criticizes you, and you react with hurt, not because the words truly wounded you, but because you were conditioned to depend on approval. You feel anxious about the future, not because danger is present, but because you were conditioned to equate uncertainty with threat. You chase validation, not because you need it, but because you were conditioned to believe your value comes from outside. De Mello reveals that conditioning creates a false sense of necessity. You feel you must be successful, must be liked, must be secure, must avoid discomfort. These internal musts are simply inherited fears disguised as truth. Until you question them, you remain trapped in a prison you don't even realize you're in. He emphasizes that conditioning affects not only emotions, but perception itself. You don't see reality, you see your programming. Two people can experience the same event and interpret it completely differently because each is reacting to their past, not the present moment. Awareness breaks this spell by showing you the script running your life. De Mello does not ask you to fight conditioning, only to see it when you observe your automatic reactions without judgment. They lose their power. When you recognize, this is conditioning, you create a space between the stimulus and your response. In that space lies freedom. The moment you become aware of your programming, you stop being ruled by it. You can choose instead of react. You can pause instead of spiral. You can meet life directly rather than through the filters of your past. The message is liberating. You are not your conditioning. You are the awareness that notices it. And once you see the prison clearly, the walls begin to crumble on their own. Section 4. Seeing without judgment. De Mello explains that the essence of awareness is learning to see reality without filtering it through judgment. The moment you judge something, you stop seeing it. You replace the raw experience of life with the ego's interpretation, its labels, fears, and conditioned reactions. Most people never encounter life directly. They encounter their opinions about life. This is good. This is bad. This is success. This is failure. These judgments tighten the mind, distort perception, and lock you into unconscious patterns. Instead of meeting the moment clearly, you meet it through the lens of your past. Awareness, in contrast, is pure observation. It is the ability to watch a thought without becoming it, to feel an emotion without drowning in it, and to witness a situation without immediately forcing it into a category. When you observe your inner world without trying to change it, something subtle but profound happens. The mind begins to quiet. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move. But you are no longer pulled into them. You simply see them as they are, transient, impersonal, passing. De Mello emphasizes that this non-judgmental observation is not passive. It is transformative. What you resist persists. What you judge, you attach to. But what you observe with clarity and neutrality begins to dissolve on its own. The grip of anxiety loosens when you stop labeling it as a problem. Anger loses its fuel when you stop defending or suppressing it. Judgment feeds egoic reactions. Awareness starves them. In this spacious seeing, emotional patterns unravel naturally, and suffering softens without force. He teaches that judgment is the ego's attempt to maintain control. It wants life to be predictable, so it immediately categorizes every moment. Awareness, however, requires surrender, a willingness to let things be as they are. When you stop naming every experience as good or bad, you begin to experience life with a clarity that is impossible for the reactive mind. You see the world as it is, not as your conditioning insists it should be. The message is simple and freeing. When you stop judging, you start seeing. And when you start seeing, you start waking up. Section 5. The nature of happiness. De Mello argues that most people suffer not because happiness is hard to find, but because they look for it in the wrong place. Conditioned by society, we are taught that joy depends on external circumstances: approval, success, comfort, security, romance, possessions. We chase these things believing they will finally make us whole. But any happiness built on externals is fragile. It disappears the moment those conditions change. He explains that this conditional happiness creates emotional dependency. You feel good only when life gives you what you want, when people behave the way you expect, when events align with your preferences. In other words, your inner state becomes hostage to the world. The slightest criticism, inconvenience, or disappointment can shake your peace, because your peace is built on something unstable. True happiness, De Mello insists, is radically different. It has nothing to do with getting what you want. It comes from seeing clearly. When you become aware of your conditioning and attachments, you stop looking to the outside world for emotional fulfillment. You realize that joy is not something you achieve. It is something that arises naturally when you are free from illusions. Happiness is not a reward. It is the byproduct of awareness. He explains that real joy is unconditional. It doesn't depend on praise or success. It doesn't disappear when circumstances shift. It flows from a mind that is awake, a mind that no longer clings to desires or fears. When you stop demanding that the world make you happy, you begin to experience a calm, steady contentment that cannot be taken from you. De Mello warns that most people reject this truth because the ego prefers drama and attachment. It wants excitement, not peace. It wants emotional highs, not clarity. But these highs come with inevitable lows, trapping you in a cycle of craving and disappointment. Awareness breaks the cycle. When you see your attachments clearly, their power dissolves, and what remains is a quiet joy that does not depend on winning, achieving, or controlling anything. He summarizes the essence of happiness in a simple insight. You are happy when you are free, not when you are gratified. Freedom means seeing reality as it is, without the mind's demands. Freedom means loving without clinging and living without fear. Freedom means resting in awareness instead of chasing fulfillment. The moment you stop outsourcing your happiness, you discover that it was available all along, right here, beneath the noise of your conditioning. Section 6. Freedom through detachment. De Mello teaches that the root of emotional suffering is attachment, the belief that you need something outside yourself to be okay. Attachments are not love, or preference, or healthy desire. They are emotional dependencies that convince you your happiness is conditional. You don't suffer because you have desires. You suffer because you believe your life collapses when those desires aren't met. He explains that attachment is always rooted in fear. You cling to what you think you cannot live without: a relationship, a job, an identity, approval, comfort, or stability. And the more tightly you cling, the more fragile and anxious you become. Attachment doesn't give you security. It makes you terrified of losing what you've attached yourself to. It places your peace in the hands of people and circumstances that you cannot control. Detachment, in de Mello's teachings, is not indifference. It is not coldness, withdrawal, or apathy. Detachment is inner freedom. It is the ability to enjoy everything without depending on anything. When you're detached, you can love deeply without clinging, work passionately without anxiety, and engage fully without losing yourself. You stop treating life as something you must control and begin relating to it with openness and clarity. He emphasizes that detachment is not something you achieve through force. You don't make yourself detached by suppressing desire or pretending not to care. Detachment arises naturally when you see the truth of your attachments, how they create fear, distort perception, and hold you hostage. When awareness illuminates attachment, its grip weakens on its own. De Mello also explains that detachment brings emotional stability. When you are no longer dependent on outcomes, praise, or certainty, your mood stops swinging with the world. You become steady, grounded, and centered. You can lose a job without losing yourself, face rejection without collapsing, and experience discomfort without panic. With detachment comes a profound sense of inner space. You respond instead of react. You choose instead of cling. You appreciate without trying to possess. This freedom allows you to live with fullness, because you are no longer trying to bend life to satisfy your emotional demands. The core of detachment is simple. Choose everything, cling to nothing, experience deeply, depend on nothing for your peace. This is not a life of less. It is a life of more. More clarity, more freedom, more presence, more authentic love. When you stop needing life to be a certain way, you finally discover the peace that was impossible to find through control or attachment. Section 7. Pain, Suffering, and the Path to Clarity. De Mello distinguishes sharply between pain and suffering. Pain is a natural part of being human. Physical discomfort, emotional hurt, the loss of something meaningful. Pain arises and passes like weather. Suffering, however, is something different. Suffering is the mind's resistance to pain. It is the stories, attachments, and demands that the ego adds on top of what is already happening. He explains that pain becomes suffering when you cannot accept the moment as it is. When you say, "This shouldn't be happening," or "I cannot bear this," you create a second layer of distress more damaging than the pain itself. The ego fights reality, and in that struggle, amplifies the discomfort. The pain is in the circumstance. The suffering is in the resistance. But De Mello teaches that pain can be a powerful teacher when met with awareness. Pain reveals where you are attached, afraid, or asleep. It exposes emotional dependencies and outdated beliefs. It pushes the ego into the open, making its patterns easier to see. When you bring awareness to pain, it becomes a doorway to understanding, not a prison. He emphasizes that you do not need to suppress, avoid, or analyze your pain. You simply need to observe it. Feel the sensation. Notice the emotion, watch the thoughts that arise with it. When you enter pain consciously, without judgment or resistance, something remarkable happens. The pain may remain, but the suffering begins to dissolve. You discover that you can feel deeply without being controlled by what you feel. De Mello also explains that suffering is often a sign that something untrue is being clung to. A false belief, an unrealistic expectation, or a dependency that no longer serves you. When you ask, "What is this trying to show me?" pain transforms into clarity. Every discomfort becomes a guide pointing towards something within you that needs to be seen. The key insight is simple. Pain is unavoidable. Suffering is optional. When you stop resisting reality and start observing it, you break the cycle that keeps you trapped in emotional turmoil. You learn to face life with openness rather than fear. And in that openness, clarity naturally arises. Pain wakes you up. Awareness liberates you, and together, they lead you toward inner freedom. Section 8. Awareness as transformation. De Mello teaches that true transformation doesn't come from effort, discipline, or self-improvement techniques. It comes from awareness, the simple act of seeing yourself clearly. When you shine the light of awareness on your fears, attachments, habits, and conditioning, those patterns begin to lose their power. Change happens, not because you force it, but because you finally understand the truth behind your behavior. He emphasizes that awareness is not analysis. It is not thinking about your emotions or dissecting your past. Analysis keeps you in the mind. Awareness brings you beyond it. Awareness is the silent witnessing of your inner world, thoughts, sensations, impulses, without judgment, resistance, or identification. When you observe something clearly, you are no longer trapped inside it. De Mello explains that many people try to change through willpower, but willpower only rearranges the surface. Ego-driven change creates temporary results, followed by relapse and frustration. Real change comes when you see the root of your behavior, the unconscious fear, the attachment, the belief, and it dissolves because you no longer believe in it. Awareness exposes illusions. When you see that a fear is imaginary, it loses its grip. When you see that an attachment creates suffering, you loosen your hold. When you see that your anger is a conditioned reaction, it begins to soften. Awareness does not force transformation. It reveals the truth, and the truth transforms you. He writes that awakening is not about becoming better, but about becoming free. Free from emotional dependencies, free from unconscious patterns, free from the ego's constant demands. As awareness deepens, your reactions naturally become lighter, your emotions less consuming, and your decisions more aligned with clarity rather than impulse. De Mello compares awareness to the sun. The sun doesn't fight darkness, it simply shines, and the darkness disappears. In the same way, awareness does not battle your patterns, it illuminates them, and in that illumination, they fall away. The insight is profound. You do not change yourself. You simply see yourself, and change follows naturally. Awareness is both the path and the destination. It is the beginning of freedom, the process of freedom, and the experience of freedom itself. Final reflection: living awake, living free. In the closing message of awareness, Anthony de Mello makes it clear that awakening is not a mystical achievement. It is a way of living. It is the ongoing practice of seeing reality without filters, meeting each moment without resistance, and allowing life to unfold without the ego's constant interference. Awareness is not something you reach. It is something you return to again and again. De Mello invites you to recognize that nothing outside you can give lasting peace, not praise, not success, not relationships, not comfort. These things can bring pleasure, but not freedom. Freedom comes from seeing clearly, from understanding how conditioning, attachment, and unconscious beliefs create the illusion that you need something external to be whole. When you see the illusion, you are no longer trapped inside it. He emphasizes that living awake doesn't mean withdrawing from the world. It means entering the world fully, without clinging, without fear, without the desperation to make reality match your expectations. You still love, work, create, and connect, but with lightness instead of need, with clarity instead of compulsion. You participate in life without being enslaved by it. Awareness turns ordinary moments into opportunities for presence. A disagreement becomes a mirror. A fear becomes insight. A disappointment becomes freedom. Every experience becomes a chance to wake up, to see the ego's patterns and step beyond them. As you do, your life becomes less reactive, less anxious, less bound by old wounds. You begin to live with a quiet steadiness that cannot be shaken by circumstances. De Mello's final message is simple and liberating. There is nothing to attain. There is only something to see. When you see clearly, suffering softens, love expands, and peace emerges on its own. You discover that the freedom you've been searching for has always been here, beneath the noise of the mind, in the silence of awareness, in the simplicity of this very moment. To live awake is to live free, and to live free is to finally live. Download this summary in high-quality MP3 format at MindShelf.net. For more timeless book summaries on spiritual growth, psychology, self-improvement, and the art of living wisely, subscribe to MindShelf on YouTube and keep expanding your inner library of wisdom. Grow in awareness. Live in balance. This is MindShelf.